Actually, I'm outside Russia for nearly 3 months, as everybody could understand. And the title of my lecture is "The Sarmatian Archaeological Culture as Imagined Entity." So it would have several parts. These 4 parts you see here. And we start with the first one, with the introduction. Sarmatians is a concept whose meaning changes according to the historical context. In the first text created by Greeks and Romans, the term Sarmatians is used as the name of a specific people, as a collective name of a number of tribes, and as a synonym for nomads. Sarmatians in the form of Sauromations were first placed near the lake of Maeotis, Sea of Azov, and the Tanes River Don. Vipsanius Agrippa, known through Pliny the Elder, located the historical region of Sarmatia between Dnieper and the Volga rivers, as well as in the North Caucasus region. Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD divided Sarmatia into European and Asian parts. He placed Asiatic Sarmatia between European Sarmatia in the west, Scythia and part of the Sarmatia and part of the Caspian Sea in the east, the states of the Caucasus in the south, and an unknown land in the north. Having been formed within Greco-Roman literature, the Sarmatian topos passed into the medieval European historical tradition. The printing of classical words resulting, among other things, in the extrapolation of the information collected there to the map of modern Europe, where the formation of nation states and national identities was beginning. The phenomenon of Sarmatism arose in the Rzeczpospolita, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whose upper class, Szlachta, traced its origin to the ancient Sarmatians. This self-identification was reflected in the Szlachta's choice of material culture, including military and ceremonial dress. In Russia, interest in the history of the North Pontic region, including that of the Sarmatians, arose in the 18th century. After Peter the Great proclaimed the Russian Empire, its integration into the European world system began. Among other things, it became necessary to write the history of this young European state, expounding the ancient origins of the peoples inhabiting it and the links between them and the history of Europe in general. Ideas about the constant migrations of peoples in the North Pontic region and the historical role of the region as a buffer zone between East and West became the core of the cultural historical model then developing in Russian historical scholarship. On this basis, an etiological myth of the Russian Empire was formed. This myth explained the impressive size of the Russian Empire and described its historical role in the destiny of Europe. By the time archaeological evidence began to be used for historical construction, this concept had become an archetype in the minds of the empire's inhabitants, which influenced the formation of ideas about the Sarmatian archaeological culture. So, searching for ancestral homeland. Many burial sites that are now attributed to the Sarmatian archaeological culture were excavated at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries on the territory of modern Ukraine and Russia, including where ancient authors located the historical region of Sarmatia. Dmitry Samokhvasov considered complexes dating from the 1st to the 5th centuries AD to be Sarmatian, using Roman imports to date them. His classification aimed primarily at chronological grouping of the remains. He was not attempting to define an archaeological culture. At the time, it was generally believed that the earliest Sauromato-Sarmatian burial mounds should be sought in the region between the Don and the Volga rivers, the Caspian Sea, and the North Caucasus. It happened, however, that burial mounds near the village of Prokhorovka in Orenburg province became the first archaeological site directly associated with the Sarmatians, although they were located very far from their historic territory. 4 burial mounds were excavated near Prokhorovka by Sergei Rudenko in 1915. Mikhail Rostovtsev provided their historical interpretation. In accordance with his ideas about processes that took place in antiquity on the steppes of Eurasia, Rostovtsev considered the Prokhorovka burials to be the burials of the Sarmatian military elite who appeared in the Urals during the first wave of migration from the east and subjugated the local population. This military elite soon moved further west. Rostovtsev drew a clear distinction between the burial complexes belonging to the ruling class of the population, the equestrian knights, it means the Sarmatians, and the ordinary burials of the local population who were subordinate to them. Rostovtsev included imports of Eastern origin, golden torques, ceremonial swords sewn on plaques in geometric shapes, phosphalaire, polychrome brooches, and objects in the new animal style among the main characteristics of the elite culture he identified. He introduced the terms Iranicization, Sarmatization to explain a number of innovations in costume, weaponry, and funeral rites in the burial complexes of the Roman period from the Bosporan Kingdom, the Chersonesos, and Olbia, including representations on gravestone stelae and crypt paintings. However, by identifying certain categories and types of objects as Sarmatian, Rostovtsev was making an assumption, for his conclusion was not achieved by a chain of explicit arguments. This does not mean that his conclusions were fundamentally wrong, but they had to be taken on faith. That inevitably happened given Rostovtsev's academic authority. However, he was not specifically aiming to define the Sarmatian archaeological culture. That was done by other researchers. The term culture was already used in the 19th century in relation to various typical assemblages of archaeological material. Most often, culture meant an ethnographic complex or a group of relatively contemporaneous sites, but as a complex of regularly associated traits, which is the material expression of what would today be called a people, culture only began to be used in the 20s and 1930s. In the definition by Child, the concept of an archaeological culture as being associated with a particular people was expressed explicitly. Thus, Child acknowledged the basic possibility of transferring the concept of culture from a living society to a complex of ancient material objects and their context. In fact, he implied their fusion in such a way that one could equate them without additional research. The consequence of this approach was ethnic ascription of specific types of objects and structures. After the end of the First World War, fundamental institutional changes, including the reorganization of science, took place in the Russian Empire's successor state, the Soviet Union. By 1925, broadly speaking, scholars were no longer permitted to freely form scientific ideas, but instead were compelled to adhere to the centralized, dominant communist ideology. In historical, ethnographic, and archaeological works, there was a shift in research subjects towards the study of peoples as opposed to the study of elites. In many regions, the first classifications of archaeological sites were carried on, and the identification of archaeological cultures began. However, the concept of the stages of development of mankind, which was developed and supported by the state at that moment, slowed down the use of scholarship on these newly identified archaeological cultures by the academic public in the USSR. The local history movement was particularly active in the Lower Volga and Ural regions, where a large center of archaeological scholarship emerged. Numerous barrow mounds, Saratov scholars excavated in the region. This became the empirical basis for identifying the Sarmatian archaeological culture. The dating of common finds, primarily weapons, was doubtless an achievement. It made it possible to construct relative and absolute chronologies of the burial assemblages. To obtain absolute dates, imports, mainly of Western origin, were essential. However, this fact gradually disappeared from the site, since scholars, however erroneously and indeed tautologically, believed that chronological sequences ought to be mainly based on local, let's say, ethnographic material. Paul Rau identified two chronological groups, which he named in accordance with the differences in their orientations, Ost-West Grebe and Meridional Grebe. He assigned the first to the Scythians and the second to the Sarmatians. He noted similarities in the funerary rites of both groups of burials, including deposition of weapons in male graves. Differences between Scythian and Sarmatian burials related mainly to the types of weapons and ceramics. In particular, arrowheads and bladed weapons showed chronologically significant variability. Since weapons were frequently found in the burials of the Volga-Ural region, these objects actually formed the basis of the periodization of the complexes. In contrast to Rostovtsev, Saratov researchers believed that the Volga-Ural elite burials belonged to the same archaeological culture as the ordinary burials of the main population. From this, they concluded that the local population was also Sarmatian. Soon after the Second World War, a number of archaeological cultures of the early Iron Age were almost simultaneously identified in the territories of the USSR. They immediately became part of historical reconstructions of those territories. On the basis of pre-war research, a model of the Sauromato-Sarmatian archaeological culture was developed. This model saw the Sauromato-Sarmatian archaeological culture as a sequence of related cultures or stages that developed autochthonously from the beginning of the early Iron Age to the Great Migration period. Within this model, cultures or stages were named in two ways, after the reference site or after the ethnicity, let's say Sarmatian, with the addition of an indication of the culture's place in the chronological scheme, early, middle, and late. Some features were identified as common for all Sarmatian cultures. The absence of settlements, burial and barrows, particular grave pit shapes, the presence of weapons in male graves, and animals as elementary offerings in ordinary burials. Differences that defined individual Sarmatian cultures included frequencies of combinations of grave pit shapes, certain elements of the burial rite, as well as specific types of grave goods. The choice of these particular traits as culture forming, that is, as culture defining, was not debated. All reference sites, Blumenfeld, Prokhorovka, Susly, Shipovo, were located in the Volga-Ural region, as you see with red dots. By that time, this region had begun to be seen as the ancestral home of the Sarmatians. Since then, archaeologists also searched for Sarmatian features in the territories which, according to the culture historical paradigm, the bearers of the Sarmatian archaeological culture had penetrated in the course of the so-called Sarmaticization. However, formal procedures to prove these conclusions were not developed. In particular, there was no clear definition of what was meant by the process of Sarmaticization. Did Sarmaticization refer to the physical penetration of representatives of the Sarmatian ethnic groups? Did it refer to the adoption of Sarmatian economy or ideology? Nor did archaeologists explain how the process of Sarmaticization could be expressed in material remains, or how it could be distinguished from other processes. In consequence, speculation, often characterized as common sense, was widespread. In the 1980s, discoveries in northern Afghanistan at Tila Tepe led to the adaptation of Mikhail Rostovtsev's ideas about ways of Sarmatian migrations from the Far East to the model of successive Sarmatian archaeological cultures or stages. Each succeeding culture was associated with a specific hegemonic tribe that appeared from the East. For example, early Sarmatian culture was associated with the Aorsi, Siraki, and Roxolani. Middle Sarmatian culture with the Alani, and so on. In this context, the term stage, that is, with each stage part of the evolving whole constituted by the Sarmatian archaeological culture, became less frequently used in the discourse of sarmatologists. Attention now focused on the differences between Sarmatian cultures. The eponymous names nearly disappeared with a new purely ethnic model. Eastern imports and their imitations again began to play a decisive role as culture defining. These objects were found mainly in elite burials and belonged to prestige markers. However, the same importance was not attached to Western imports. The analysis of social structure and the identification of local variants of nomadic societies inhabiting the Eurasian steppe between the Ural and the Don rivers in ancient times became another area of research. For this purpose, a group of Russian and Italian scholars carried out a fundamental statistical study of burial sites in the Lower Don, Cuban, Volga, and Ural regions. The Italian team carried out a statistical analysis of the burials from the Sarmatian period. The Russian group of scientists concentrated themselves on the description of the funeral rite of the Volga and Ural nomads and their comparative analysis. However, the researchers involved interpreted their results mainly on the basis of their pre-existing ideas about the nature of cultural historical processes in antiquity, with a preference for interpretations that attributed change to the movement of ethnic groups. Recently, the usual points were repeated. Anatoly Skripkin rightly noted that the concept of archaeological culture appears to be a subjective reconstruction created in the process of desk work, but he implicitly adheres to the idea of an archaeological culture as an ethnographic complex. In fact, quoting the concepts of historical Sarmatians and Sarmatian archaeological culture. In the works of researchers devoted to the other archaeological cultures of the North Pontic region associated with barbarian societies of the same chronological period, for example, Meotian or late Scythian cultures, almost any innovation is explained by an influx of Sarmatians and a gradual increase in the number of Sarmatian elements. It seems that the existing interpretive model of the Sarmatian archaeological culture is not epistemologically rigorous. Often, there is no logical link between the thesis and the arguments, whereby the thesis is purportedly substantiated. As a result, the force of the argument is rather psychological in nature. Authority and appeals to common sense rather than scholarly argument have undue weight in discussions of the Sarmatian archaeological culture. There are two basic but mutually exclusive principles governing the identification of archaeological cultures. First one, an archaeological culture may be defined as a complex of formal features. In this case, the term culture is applied to antiquities found in a territory about which or about whose population there is no historical evidence. The second, by an archaeological culture, one might understand all material remains found within a historical region or in the supposed location of a historically known society or state mentioned in written sources. Both principles, when applied consistently, have research potential. However, in the case of the Sarmatian archaeological culture, researchers confuse these two principles. In some cases, they mean a complex of specific features, and in other cases, archaeological sites located in territory which, according to written sources, was occupied by the Sarmatians. Significant differences between archaeological materials found in different territories that are called Sarmatian are explained by changes in culture in the course of migrations and are often declared cultural variants. Poor argumentation in the analysis of the archaeological evidence ascribed to the Sarmatians can be illustrated by the following typical situations. Scholars assume that Sarmatians appeared in a certain region on the basis of written sources, which are not usually very detailed, and try to demonstrate their presence through a search for features of the Sarmatian archaeological culture in the local material. And the second, scholars record some innovations in local material culture and associate them with the hypothetical appearance or influence of the Sarmatians without providing evidence for this. In both cases, the arguments are insufficient and inconsistent. There is no direct causal relationship between the arguments' starting points and their conclusions. The movement of people to other territories is not always accompanied by a change in the material culture of that territory. I am an example of this. In fact, changes in material culture are often associated not with the appearance of migrants, but other factors, for example, political or economical. I see the core problem in the fact that the analyzed phenomenon and the arguments for its interpretation belong to different kinds of sources, written and archaeological, which should be studied using the methods of their respective disciplines. Historical conclusions using the material of the Sarmatian archaeological culture are thus largely speculative. They do not follow rigorous research procedure and cannot be verified. The matter is complicated by the fact that the interpretive model of the Sarmatian archaeological culture was formed not as a result of a scholarly generalization, but as it were spontaneously within the Russian cultural space under the influence of the Sarmatian paradigm codified during the 18th and 19th centuries. In a sense, from the very beginning, all researchers are under the influence of the research object they study due to their cultural and political identity. In general, archaeological research methods have not been sufficiently developed yet with respect to the barbarian archaeological cultures of the North Pontic region. Because research methods remain undeveloped and archaeology continues to be used as mere illustration, scholars simply use it to affirm historical arguments that lack detail, rather than developing arguments on the basis of archaeological material. The more these essentially tautological arguments are produced, the more difficult it becomes to develop arguments that differ from them. As a result, the existing model of Sarmatian archaeological culture works as a closed system, creating interpretive pressure and blocking the acquisition of new knowledge. I suggest that the way forward lies in the deliberate separation of the historical and archaeological principles of research and the development of specific methods of archaeological analysis. For this, it is necessary to assess the heuristic potential of archaeological culture as a scientific tool. Recognition of the ontological content and epistemological perspective of archaeology began in the Soviet Union shortly after the Second World War and continued until the early 90s. Archaeological culture was recognized to be a key research tool for the study of social processes using archaeological evidence. Some researchers regarded an archaeological culture to be the result of a subjective systematization and organization of material, a specific cognitive category that did not matter outside the cognitive process. Many others believed that it was a thing in itself, a stable complex of material objects and features that in practical application should be easily recognized. The attitude of a researcher on this matter influences the ways they study the historical reality behind the phenomenon of an archaeological culture. Almost all archaeological studies of the North Pontic Barbaricum in the Sarmatian period are based on the idea of archaeological culture as thing in itself, It means an objective phenomenon which is a direct reflection of real ancient societies. However, the assumption that cultures are clearly defined, essentially self-contained entities, has been subjected to serious doubt in modern archaeology. Realizing the impossibility of a complete rejection of a century-old scientific discourse, I suggest the use in parallel of a network model of archaeological culture, making a bridge between already existing routinized explanatory processes and new, more complex research techniques. Network approaches to archaeology have become increasingly popular over the past decade. Such research methods have been applied to study the transmission of ideas, the movement of people and objects, the identification of social and cultural boundaries, interregional interaction, and maritime connectivity. Still, formal network methods have not yet been used for the conceptualizing archaeological cultures. This is not surprising in Anglophone academic literature, where the concept of archaeological culture has been little used since the time of the new archaeology, except perhaps, at least implicitly, by more culture historical archaeologists like classical archaeologists. However, for the archaeology of post-Soviet countries, where this concept is still widely in fashion, it is necessary to clarify its meaning. Material remains undoubtedly are part of objective reality and have been influenced by various processes. Their very appearance in a living culture is the result of social network interaction. Interaction networks, under this term, I understand systems of communication channels localized in a given space and functioning through individuals and their groups. The main properties of interaction networks are entities of interaction, scale, and duration. Entities of interaction can be things and ideas. The scale of network refers to the geographical range of its functioning within a specific period. It is obvious that networks of any kind can be of a different scale depending on the social groups to which interacting individuals belong and the functions of the distributed objects or ideas. The duration of the functioning of a certain network is an indicator of the stability of the ties of individuals or social groups that it unites. Accordingly, the beginning and termination in the spread of certain entities of interaction mark changes in the functioning of a particular network. They are signs of the corresponding links breaking or changing their content due to some factors. All these properties of interaction networks are reflected in archaeological material. Entities of interaction appear in archaeological material in the form of objects or ideas. Although ideas are intangible, some are expressed in material form. Specific elements of grave constructions and buildings. Here you see the idea of Portechism and Peribol in case of Chersonesos, and trying to repeat this idea in case of Akayas or this late season fortress. Yeah. If who has a question, we can discuss it later. Then in images, yeah. So the scale of networks can be defined by mapping entities of interaction. Because some ideas are expressed in material form, they can be mapped, and thus the breadth of their distribution can be determined. Like in this case with the earrings, Yeah. Finally, the comparison of maps for successive chronological periods. Here with different color, you see different periods. Allows one to formulate assumptions about the beginning, duration, and termination of the corresponding network. Thus, in the context of a network model, an archaeological culture could be regarded as a stable assemblage of material features reflecting network connections that have been formed and that have functioned in a certain territory during a specific period. Whereas the actual archaeological remains are part of the objective reality, the integration into an archaeological culture depends on the goals that the researcher, consciously or unconsciously, sets when identifying that culture. As a rule, scholars pay attention to several of the most striking features of a culture, which they consider to be culture defining, and according to which they assign specific sites or assemblages to a certain archaeological culture. For instance, Stone Age cultures are distinguished according to the peculiarities of their stone industries. The early medieval Chernyakov culture is defined according to specific forms of ceramics and so on. Thus, they differ in their entities of interaction. Yeah, in case of Paleolithic culture, stone tools; in case of Chernyakov culture, ceramics. Depending on the features identified as culture defining, various phenomena can stand behind a specific archaeological culture. A special technology, an economic cultural type, a common ideology, etc. All features, including those that are not recognized as culture defining, can have coterminous, smaller or larger distribution areas. The chronological range of their existence may also differ. Some network relationships inevitably extend beyond the time span or the area of distribution of the features regarded as culture defining. Obviously, it is precisely such periods that are described as transition periods in the academic literature that uses the discourse of archaeological culture. Areas with incomplete or mixed sets of culture-defining features are usually regarded as local variants of archaeological culture. The division of an archaeological culture into local variants or its joining into a larger unit with other chronologically similar cultures, consciously or unconsciously, is determined by the networks which a researcher considers essential for a given taxonomic unit. The interpretation of individual taxonomic units depends on the nature of the network relationships beyond them. The transformation of one ecological culture to another, expressed by a noticeable change in its material features, should mean a change or termination of network connections as a result of events or processes that have occurred. By analyzing the essence of the changes that have happened, it should be possible to reconstruct their causes, political, economic, social, and ideological, with a sufficient degree of probability. Thus, the archaeological cultures that scholars purport to identify are imagined entities, imagined, constructed from outside by a scholar. They cannot be a priori correlated with specific societies, political structures, and ethnic groups. Their connection to the real societies of the past needs additional proof. Conclusion. So, according to the network model, archaeological cultures formulated by means of formal criteria It means according to culture-defining features, should be the basis of research. The Sarmatian archaeological culture is a scholarly construct that has existed for a long time, but its properties as a research tool have not yet been determined. The purpose of its identification has not been laid out. The Sarmatian archaeological culture is simply perceived to be an objective reality that one needs just to study. No studies of the Sarmatian archaeological culture explicitly list its culture-defining features. Its geographic scope is not formally defined. As a result, scholars have basically argued that Sarmatians moved across Eurasia and that everything supposedly left behind in their wake is the Sarmatian archaeological culture. This gives rise to an unlimited number of cultural variants that are not defined by formal criteria. Most datable artifacts in Sarmatian graves are imports and reflect global trends in the formation of network connections due to political and economic circumstances, not ethnic changes. In order to make the Sarmatian archaeological culture work as a research tool, it is necessary to formulate the goal of research and to highlight the culture-defining features of the Sarmatian archaeological culture in accordance with this goal. The range of meanings of the concept Sarmatians in ancient written sources and then additionally in the academic literature is very wide. It can refer to inhabitants of the geographic region Sarmatia, a people like ethnonym, a group of peoples, nomads, political elites, bearers of the Sauromato-Sarmatian archaeological culture, a population that buried its dead under burial mounds and areas with sedentary populations, as well as individuals belonging to the sedentary population whose burials involve features that are speculatively interpreted to be Sarmatian, such as crossed legs, pieces of chalk. This spectrum of meanings makes it possible to set various goals for the study of material remains associated with the Sarmatians. Most often, the concept Sarmatian archaeological culture is used in connection with a nomadic way of life. If a scholar aims to identify remains belonging to nomadic people, that is to study archaeological cultures corresponding to nomads, the most basic culture-defining features of the archaeological culture that scholar conceptualizes should be burial mounds and in the absence of settlements, the presence of a knife and a meat offering about grave goods, mainly from ovicaprines, which appear to have formed the basis of Eurasian nomads' livestock, can also be considered diagnostic of nomadism. Another characteristic feature of nomadic archaeological culture, at least in antiquity, in the presence of bladed weapons in a large number of male burials. Such finds are rare in the burials of the settled populations. The rest of the features, often described as culture-defining, are hardly a direct consequence of the nomadic way of life. In any case, this must be proven. They could reflect specific ideologies, military technologies, or the everyday culture of the Sarmatian era on the steppes of Eurasia. Mapping of the culture-defining features associated with nomadism makes it possible to trace the appearance and disappearance of populations practicing nomadism across Eurasia. Using this procedure, we can definitely identify nomadic sites in the 1st century BC in the southern part of the Don Dnieper interflow, where they were absent about 2 centuries earlier. At about the same time, nomadic sites in the Don Delta were replaced by a sedentary population. The reasons for the appearance or disappearance of nomadic features in these areas are open to debate. They might be due to migration or environmental or social factors. By specifying the subject of our network connection, it means choosing a specific network to research, we determine the scope of our research questions. The material features specific to nomads have a wide chronological framework, from antiquity to Middle Ages. When we distinguish individual nomadic cultures as Scythian, Sarmatian, etc., we consciously or unconsciously refer to features that are common within narrower chronological periods and within a limited territory. The features that distinguish between the early, middle, and late Sarmatian cultures clearly belong to this number. These features might reflect ideological, military, or economic network. Thus, the almost universal change of orientation of burials from east-west to north-south, which occurred in the steppe zone of Eurasia during the 4th and 3rd century BC, is clearly associated with a change in ideology. But most of the differences between various nomad archaeological cultures or cultural groups relate to the types of artifacts used in the funeral ceremony. Since ordinary burials are usually limited to a standard set of objects, which often cannot be satisfactorily dated, these differences are most clear in the complexes with a wide range of burial goods, namely elite burials. Ultimately, the study of network connections based on the material of elite burials is key to defining the self-identification of individual nomadic collectives and accordingly determining the boundaries of individual societies, as well as their foreign policy context. Using a network conception of the Sarmatian archaeological culture, I have analyzed changes in the burial rites, composition of burial goods, and special distribution of the elite graves of the Volga-Don region in 4 chronological periods. Should I ask if you are tired? Shall we see some examples? What do you think?
Yes, please.
Oh, yes, please. Okay. So I just hope that, yeah, I'm speaking too long, I'm afraid. So the maps. So the majority, it is the first period, so from 3rd to 2nd century BC. The majority of elite graves, here you see circles are women and rectangles are men. They are dating to the period from the 3rd to the 2nd centuries BC. They are situated in cemeteries mainly on the left bank of the Volga, showing it to be a major center of power. Ritual deposits, white triangles. I don't know if you see my movement. So try to find white triangles. They mark western part of the region. These ritual deposits are likely not connected with nomadic societies. The fact that different cultural traditions intersect in the Volga-Don area is quite probable evidence of the coexistence of societies belonging to different economic cultural types in one ecological niche. Such cases are known from ethnography. In the 1st century BC, the western part of the region is still marked by finds of ritual deposits, and in practically the same places. There are several centers of power in the region. One particularly wealthy grave, Osika Bero, in the Volga region, might be evidence of the centralization process among the Volga-Don nomadic groups, their unification probably under one ruler, and the formation of a complex chiefdom, possibly including the simple chiefdoms and segmentary societies of the Lower Don and Volga groups. The special distribution of the elite burial complexes of the period from the 1st to the mid-2nd century AD shows remarkable changes. In the western part of the Volga-Don region, there are no ritual deposits anymore. In the Lower Don area, elite burials are concentrated in the same places as they were before, by the mouth of the Don between Sal and Manich and south of the Volga-Don interflow. Specifically, in these areas, 4 hierarchically related groups of elite burials, including ostentatious burials, its special term, have been observed. Exceedingly rich burials are situated by the Don Delta and south of the Volga-Don interflow. So these two groups. Thus, two major centers of power, likely competing with each other, can be distinguished in the Lower Don area. Since the previous period, the center of power has obviously moved from the Lower Volga Desert westwards to the vicinity of the Bosporan city of Tanais and to the area controlling the Volga-Don transshipment. In the period from the mid-2nd to the mid-3rd century AD, the distribution and composition of elite burials changes. The only big cluster of the elite burials is located now in the Don Delta, most of them very close to Bosporan city of Tanais. The lack of rich burials and the concentration of elite burials with similar assemblages in one area appears to be evidence of the formation of new relationships between various nomadic and semi-nomadic groups. It is quite likely that these groups were united under the leadership of the group controlling the Don Delta in a complex chiefdom, which was entangled in close, not necessarily friendly, political relations with the sedentary population of the Azov region, in other words, the Bosporan kingdom. An additional source of information in the composition and origin of the prestige items, that is, entities of interaction found in these graves, as well as their relation to the status of the deceased. So, yeah, now it is a bit complicated, but so, yeah, try to follow me. So extra-cultural, yeah, I should explain a bit. So intracultural, it means it is something which you find inside your cultural group. Extra-cultural, so I explain, yeah, it is imported originals, but most interesting are cross-cultural things. It means that people, they wanted to reproduce these imported things. Yeah, they make replicas, they make derivatives, they make hybrids. So it means they are very important for them. Yeah. So how we could follow the connections, the mental connection, political ties, yeah, with this, yeah, with other societies, mainly civilizations, yeah. So now I will show you two tables. One is about costume, another is about burial offerings. I don't know how you can get in, yeah, but anyway. Extra-cultural and cross-cultural prestige items are rarely found in the first, my first chronological group, let's say 3rd and 2nd century BC. So you see, for example, harness decorations from North Pontic workshops, some of which imitating seasoned Thracian or Ionian models. They have been recovered from the Western group of elite burials. You remember these depositions, codes. In the Eastern group of elite burials, derivatives of Hellenistic earrings made in northern Black Sea region have been found. as well as belt fittings, which are a specific marker of social status in the male burials of the Eastern group, and they demonstrate network connections with the culture of Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, Transbaikalia. I don't show everything. Yeah? The center place of these belts are both direct imports, yeah, so extracultural in origin, and their derivatives, that is cross-cultural object. It means it was very important for them to reproduce it. The reproduction of such derivatives indicates their significance in the local cultural environment and probably intensive connections between the elites of the Eurasian steppes. Very specific things, ritual plates with zoomorphic images, carved of wood and plated with gold. They appear in male elite graves not earlier than the 2nd century BC, and only within the very small area, northern part of the Volga-Don interflow. One thing which we find in Cuban region, it should be connected somehow, maybe, yeah, maybe even with migration of some Volga-Don barbarians to the Cuban region, but it is another question. So they are found, pardon. So the use of zoomorphic images in their decoration may indicate ideological ties between the elites of the Volga region and Iranian cultures. These ties might be owed to both social and political ideological factors. In the 1st century BC, prestige, so this column is the 1st century BC, you see much more imports and cross-cultural objects. So you see much of difference in this column. Female burials in the eastern area contain jewelry items manufactured in Cuban and Central Asian production centers, along with derivatives of Hellenistic examples. Male burials include many extracultural costume items from the Cuban region, Transcaucasia, particularly this from Kasica, yeah? Asia Minor and Parthia, as well as the aforementioned Central Asian belts and their cross-cultural derivatives. So other extracultural innovations among the prestige goods are constituted by Italian bronze, silver, and glass vessels, which are valuables, as well as golden wreath characteristic. Yeah, this is the only case, yeah, in the Volga-Don region. Golden wreath, funeral wreath, characteristic of the Greco-Roman civilization. These extracultural items indicate direct or indirect contacts between the Volga-Don barbarian elites and both the Iranian and Greco-Roman civilizations, whose struggle for world domination during this period presumably led to the appearance of a more complex social structure and the centralization of elites of the Volga-Don region. For our argument, the means of obtaining prestige items is not of great value. Important is the fact of their inclusion in the funeral ceremony, their deposition in the funeral complex. So in the following period, so the third column from the 1st to the mid-2nd century AD is marked by changes in the location of the centers of power in the region, which shifted from Lower Volga to Lower Don and the Volga-Don interflow. Ritual deposits disappear this time. And prestige objects that are characteristic of male burials, ceremonial weapons, horse harnesses appear also in some female elite burials. This may be the result of both internal factors and foreign policy changes. Foreign relations proceeded in the same directions as they had in the previous period, that is toward Iranian civilization, which is manifested in female and male costumes as well as in burial goods. The proliferation or derivatives of Iranian prestige items made in local workshops indicates that barbarian elite were mainly politically oriented toward Iranian civilization, and the discovery of a ceremonial dagger near the village of Dachi essentially confirms this. The composition and quality of prestige items cannot be explained only by the results of several campaigns conducted by the Volga-Don barbarians in Transcaucasia. The borrowing of ideas and the reproduction of an artistic tradition indicate close cultural and probably military political ties with Parthian Iran, perhaps even the political control of the Volga-Don barbarians by Parthian Iran. Here then, so this fourth column, so we see how it changes to intercultural entities of interaction hint at cultural change by the mid-2nd century AD. The gold-plated wooden ritual plates, which were very specific for the region in the 3 previous periods, disappeared from the male sets of prestige items, perhaps due to the transformation of social relations in the region. Further changes to male burial assemblages, including the disappearance of kivas with gold fittings, the appearance of whips with precious elements, and an increase in the percentage of long swords, likely reflect changes in the representation of buried men's military status. For example, as heavily armed horsemen instead of archers. Continued contacts with the Bosporan kingdom are suggested by extracultural items originating in the North Black Sea, namely both female and male costume items and horse harnesses. The number of Eastern Iranian imports greatly decreased. Among extracultural artifacts, objects that indicate Western contacts prevail. Animal-style items are represented by isolated finds. It seems that at this time the Bosporan kingdom was an intermediary for the political contacts of the Volga-Don barbarians. The changes observed in elite graves seems to be of key importance for the explanation of the cultural changes in the Volga-Don region that led to the formation of the early, middle, and late Sarmatian archaeological cultures. These changes appear to have occurred not due to the regular migratory waves of nomads from east to west, but mainly due to the foreign political factor, in particular the development of relations between the major political players of the period, Parthian Iran and his satellites, and Rome. In the north, where the Bosporan kingdom occupied the strongest position, with its Asian part directly bordering the numerous barbarian populations, the Caucasus and the territories adjacent to it played an important strategic role. The nomadic chiefdoms of the Volga-Don region, with their significant military potential, were obviously involved in internal and foreign political conflicts with the Bosporan kingdom and the Caucasus. Evidently, some of the booty and gifts obtained in the course of military actions and the conclusions of treaties were included at the funeral ceremonies of the barbarian nobility, reinforcing their claims to leadership. This analysis does not deny the possibility of migrations from the east during the Sarmatian period, which might be more aptly researched with the help of bioarchaeological data, but it just explains the change in material culture by other factors. So I think I don't repeat something, and I end with the lecture. So thank you very much for your time.